So a little while ago, I discovered Kiva, where you can make like microloans. So basically, what this is, you can loan small amounts of money to help foreign banks support, preferably, in my opinion, people of very, very impoverished people around the world. In the My goal is to help out the pretty much the poorest people I can access in the poorest parts of the world, in the sectors of of their economy that needs the most help, so that they can basically you bolster the weakest parts of the global economy is kind of my goal. So I came up with some, thinking about it after doing it for a little while, I came up with some kind of rules of thumb, you know. So my goal is to first focus on supporting agricultural production. But in some economies, this may not make sense, as a huge portion of the population is already subsistence farming. So places like Sierra Leone and Togo are like this. And generally, would like to prefer crops over livestock, and know the context for the specific type of crop and or livestock. So one example would be, if we're in a nation that is a net importer of food, but this dude is trying to grow cattle. What are they eating? Right? If they're grass fed, just wild, okay. But if it's wheat fed or some shit, what are you doing? What are you doing? Your country isn't even producing enough food to approximately feed itself, right? You're a net importer of basic foodstuffs, but you are trying to grow livestock with imported. That doesn't make sense. That's not sustainable. That's not stable. That's a bad idea. But on the other hand, somebody who is trying to grow sorghum and rice or whatever, and it makes sense for the climate, and it makes sense for the soil, and it makes sense for the economy, absolutely support that dude, because that makes sense. Right? So, kind of have a context. But things like the economies that I'm looking at, that I'm targeting, things like cotton and coffee are probably cash crops, and very possibly contending with food production, and often these are occurring among the poorest countries. Often, these are being focused on at the expense of food production, which makes these nations, or contributes to these nations, being net importers of food. So I think that's a bad idea. Yeah. If you're a very selfish foreign investor, I guess it makes sense. But my goal here is to help stabilize the global economy, get my dollars to do more work, instead of just sitting in the bank and making a tiny amount of interest for me. Have it actually out there and operate. So $100 can end up acting like $500 or $600 or whatever, and then at the end of that, when I actually need that money, I can get it back because it's a loan, right? So as it gets paid back, what you do is you can then lend it out to somebody else, and that's how it can end up being more money effectively in the economy than it actually is on its own. Right, so that first loan, your $100 doubles, right? It becomes $200, because once it gets paid back to you, well, you still have that $100, but it worked. It did work as $100 for somebody else, and what we're doing is we're trying to focus that on real production of real goods that are valuable to keeping people alive, keeping people happy, keeping people economy sustainable, and ultimately, if enough of that is going on, you can reduce things like warfare, because people go to war when they don't have food. People tend not to go to war when they're comfortable, right? So if you can help people be comfortable with basic necessities, they're less likely to have issues like that. Anyway, okay, so this is just for me, actually. Prefer smaller loans under $1,000. One of the reasons for this, I feel like this does make sense though. One of the reasons for this is in a lot of these nations, your average annual wage is in the ballpark of $1,000 to $2,000. So if they're asking for a loan of $1,000, that's basically a year's worth of wages. That's a lot of money, contextually. So I kind of need to see some really solid justification for why somebody in a nation like that needs that amount of money. But, you know, if it's some guy saying that he's just trying to buy feed for his broiler chicks that he's raising, and he just needs $150, and he's done this before, okay, that makes sense, because that sounds about right. You can buy quite a bit of feed for that amount of money. That, depending on how many he's raising, if it's like 50 or something, that probably makes sense. That's probably about correct, and he's actually going to be profitable. That sounds right? Like, I've worked with that one enough that sounds very, very reasonable. He's, you know, things like that. But asking for $1,000 and he's just like, oh, I need to buy a pig, and it's in like Mozambique. That doesn't sound right. That doesn't make sense. So yeah, it's fine if other people want to back that one, but I'm not going to be backing that one. So, and another thing is the smaller ones are more likely to be paid back, like, partly because $1,000 is a year's wages, and whew, you're going to pay that back in a year and make a profit? I'm skeptical. It also indicates that smaller loans also indicates that the borrower likely has a more thought out plan and they know what they're doing, which ultimately indicates they might be a more competent player in their local economy. Yeah, that is sort of a overview of what I just said. Be skeptical of middlemen. So a lot of the countries that I look at are in Africa, because that's kind of the core of the poorest nations on the planet. And a lot of guys, what they want to do, what their business is basically buying and reselling things, which absolutely has its place. But given the context of the economy, that might not be useful, right? So if this is a nation that is a net importer of food, and you've got a whole bunch of people trying to just buy and sell food, that doesn't make sense. What you want to be supporting in those nations is people who are trying to produce food. You want to get to those, but it can make sense though. In those economies, it can make sense sometimes to support the middlemen. So I've seen, there was a guy that I helped fund the other day, and the biggest I ever put on any one person is $25, which is another reason that I like the smaller loans, because it makes my $25 a larger proportion of what is actually going to happen, so like what they're actually going to get. So it sort of makes it my contribution more relevant, right? Like for somebody who's asking for $3,000, if I put $25 on it, yeah, it helps, but not that much, right? If somebody's asking for $150 and I put $25 on it, that's a fairly sizable portion. So, you know, 10 other people contributing $5, $10, $20, $50, it's going to quickly add up, and that's going to work, right? Somebody's asking for $3,000, you need 400 people you know, to add up to be enough. Yeah. So yeah, this guy, what he does is he actually goes around and to farmers, and he buys up their surplus, and then he brings it back to the city and sells it. That sort of middleman in an economy where it is a net importer of food is actually good, because what he is doing is he is redistributing locally grown food. So that is the kind of middleman that I would support, absolutely. Or in nations where we already have food stability, we're already self-sufficient, like Togo, I believe. I have it listed. I think it was Togo. Yeah, currently self-sufficient in food production. Yeah, in a nation like that, businesses that are redistributing goods, that makes sense. That's going to help the economy in a real way. So, yeah, the style of small business may make sense in certain economies, but be sure that it does before lending, right? So, and as a general rule, prefer shops over individual middlemen. So, if you have a guy that actually has a storefront and maybe an employee or 2 or 10 or whatever, is actually a small business, and they're redistributing, actually it's usually women, if they're redistributing goods like this, particularly local goods, that's fantastic. I would love to support that. And as I mentioned before, be skeptical of cash crops and prefer local businesses that both grow and sell them over individuals simply acting as middlemen. So yeah, this one is based on one of my first little micro loans there, which was to a guy, I forget which country, it's in Africa somewhere. He had a small plantation where he grew coffee, but he also had a storefront where he sold various coffee products, right? So he would sell roast and sell the beans. He would roast and grind and sell the ground beans, and he would also there was like a little cafe where he would serve people, and he had a few employees, and I'm like, this is awesome. I love I love something like that. That is fantastic. It is a cash crop, so it's not as fundamentally useful as basic agriculture, but it was in one of these nations that is not a net importer of food. So looking at that, I'm like, this is absolutely the sort of business that I would really like to support in these economies to help bring everybody up to a higher standard of living. That is fantastic. Actually, yeah, this next one mentions that a coffee shop attached to a coffee plantation is very good, as it contributes to the local economy, whereas somebody simply buying coffee to sell is likely involved in exporting. So a lot of these places, you want to look at how their economy operates. If they are a net importer of food, but an exporter of things like cotton and coffee, they have good agricultural land. They should be able to produce food for themselves. And I think that should be kind of their first priority, so that they become locally stable and not fundamentally dependent upon foreign nations for basic necessities like food. And there's some countries, like probably Sri Lanka as an example, there are some countries where you probably are never going to achieve that level of self-sufficiency, so that is also a consideration. But in a nation where they are selling agricultural products at the same time as being a net importer of food, something is wrong. That's not right. It shouldn't be like that. They should be serving themselves first, making sure that they have enough food, and then any excess capacity to produce, by all means, export coffee once you are at that level where you are comfortable and you are not dependent on foreign nations for your food. A common fault in the economies we're targeting is that their exports are already too high or otherwise inappropriate and often involve cash crops like coffee and cotton. Try to avoid supporting cash crops in nations that are net importers of food. I've mentioned that many times already, as the production of these crops is directly impeding the nation's ability to feed itself. Yes. Yes. We want a stable global economy. We want nations to be able to at least basically feed themselves at a bare minimum. Like, should be... Particularly nations with... I think Mozambique is a good example that I looked up. Mozambique, net importer of food, but the soil is great for agriculture. Avoid supporting cash crops. And I have a note here, agriculture only. Right? And of course these are my rules. This is how I'm looking at it, but and you can, if you want to do these things, you can look at it however you want, but yeah, this is how I'm looking at it. This is what I think is appropriate. But then also, keep in mind how things work. Ultimately, you can only lend to those people who are requesting a loan, and it's more useful to lend to someone than no one. So simply employ these guidelines to identify the best loan you can make at the time, right? So some loans will not be repaid. So this is kind of more practical shit, right? Some loans will not be repaid. This is okay, as in that event, the loan can simply be thought of as a donation. So your dollars still contributed in some way, even if the loan doesn't get repaid, because the person, they're trying. They have the intention of repaying it. Right, and they're doing real work that is contributing to their life and to the society around them, the economy around them. So even in the case that your loans are not repaid, that there is a default, just consider it as a donation to the economy, and that's okay. And you should never loan an amount of money greater than you'd be willing to donate anyway. Right? This is like any sort of investing. Do not put money in that you can't afford to lose. Right? Now with Kiva, looking at their stats, the default rate is very, very low. Very, very low. The loss rate due to default is something like 1%. Right? So for $100 that you put in, you stand to lose on average something like $1 or $2. That's pretty damn good. Especially if you are kind of smart about this, and what you do is you use your credit card, which has like 1, 2, 5% cash back. And now you're breaking even, or maybe even slightly turning a profit if you do things right. You're not turning enough of a profit to actually, do anything with. But if you got a 5% cash back and you stand to lose $2 per $100, well, you donate $100, you'll get $5 cash back. You might lose $2, so you still made $3, and you can loan that $100 out to at least 4 people, because like the basic, like, where you can choose the amount is the bottom, the minimum is $25, but you can also have it do like a recurring $5 at a time donation, just kind of in the background. So yeah, you can help a lot of people, and with that $100 can turn into thousands of dollars if you leave it just recycling in the economy until you finally pull it out. And when you pull it out, okay, maybe you've lost, maybe it's down to $85 or something. But at that point, it's probably been a couple years, right? And it's served in the world economy as $500-$600, and you did get the $5 cash back in the first place, so it's less of a loss, and it's like, it can make sense. It can make a lot of sense, actually. Yeah. And here, most loans will be repaid. This means that each repaid dollar can be lent again to someone else. This, combined with the fact that merely the act of repaying the loans means that new capital was successfully generated in their economy. And this means that each dollar involved in this cycle produces more dollars directly, not for you personally, but for the global economy, and specifically in the most impoverished economies in the world, targeted directly at the most vitally important and impactful components of those economies, if we're doing things right. Yeah, so I think this is... I've involved some of my money in this, and I feel like it is a good investment for the whole world here, because it's yeah. So it's $100 to me, but if we do things right over a period of time, it can $100 turns into $1,000 in the global economy, and I'm still able to pull it back out and use it as $100 later on down the road, or $95 or whatever, because you're gonna incur some losses here and there. But like I said, when you make when you put the money in, you use a 5% cash back, and you lose $5 over the course of a couple years, it's still $100, right? So that the average level of risk is actually pretty much completely counteracted by using a credit card that has cash back, even a 1% cash back, that almost completely negates your average losses. So, holy crap, why wouldn't you do this? If you have some money sitting around, like you have a little bit of extra money that you don't need, and you can stand to, like it would just be sitting in the bank, accruing very tiny amounts of interest that are like, fuck all, it doesn't matter, you're not going to get rich off of that. I think this makes sense. This is a good way to do this, because you can get that money to be working for people all around the world that really need the money, and it bolsters the global economy. Yeah, I think this is a really good way to do this. As you can see, I have maps here where I was looking at things like UN Human Development Report. So yeah, it's kind of these countries that I'm focusing on here, in Africa. There's some where you can't get to with Kiva, like Afghanistan. There's nobody there. There's no field partners there. Some nations you just can't get to, but like Madagascar, Mozambique, Uganda, Rwanda, Tanzania, all of these little dudes here on the coast, right? Senegal, yeah. So yeah, I think that's a potentially very useful thing for people to do.